Now I'm on? All right. All right, well, I just gave all the really good parts of the talk, so the rest is just filler. Sorry you didn't hear that. No, just kidding. But we have a really great engineering team back home, and so it gives me an opportunity to come and talk about some really cool and fun topics. So a couple things I want to do first is just kind of level set on where the industry's at and why I think that this is kind of contributing to this need and value for context. So digital transformation, I'm sure most of you have heard this term before, but really what's happening is that technology is a competitive advantage more today than it's ever been. And a couple things that come from that, velocity is winning, right? You see these SaaS companies, whether it's Sumo or somebody else, if they ship fast, if they ship often, if they get an idea to production quickly, they're winning in their market space. And similarly, from a performance perspective, you have to win there too. You have to be able to be available, you have to be resilient, and you have to outperform your competitors. And if you don't, you can get fired really quickly. How many people here work for a SaaS company, out of curiosity? Right, pretty easy to get fired pretty quickly in that market space. And so these things matter a ton. But when we start unpacking that and talk about like what does it mean for an organization to value velocity, you start thinking about things like microservice architectures. You're probably using cloud services or managed services in the cloud to simplify some of the things that you're trying to do and deliver faster. You probably have CI/CD automation going on. And you're likely, if you're not already using Kubernetes or some other orchestration platform, you're probably looking into that. From a value and performance and availability side of things, you're probably investing in monitoring tools or observability tools like Sumo. You probably have pretty decent change management and incident management practices. And you likely have some sort of continuous improvement process in your organization or function that helps you improve from incident response or just adopt industry trends and best practices to help drive that. These two things can really actually be counterproductive to each other though, right? Like as you're maturing and figuring out how to value velocity, a lot of times that can end up impacting your availability and performance. And this is where the whole DevOps, SRE, org structure stuff really starts to fit in, right? Trying to fill that gap of how do we really do both of these things really well and deliver great services. So with all of that going on, what's happening is the complexity in our environments are increasing to enable this velocity and performance. You're seeing higher than ever change rates. You have tons of SaaS tools that are business critical, whether it's Sumo or GitHub or something else. If GitHub's down, it's pretty hard to ship new code. Microservices are really great for product agility, but they bring a whole new host of problems that you didn't have necessarily in other architectures. Products and services depend really highly on third parties. You might be in the cloud. If you're not in the cloud, you're in a physical data center. You're probably highly dependent on ISPs. And then meanwhile, legacy systems and technical debt still exist everywhere, and they make a ton of revenue, right? Anyone here not have technical debt? Oh, almost. I wish we didn't, but it's there, it's real, and it makes money. As complexity increases, our need for context increases. And I've been really happy this whole conference. I keep hearing the word context over and over again, even the straight out of context in the keynote today. So it was kind of validating for me. But just to level set definition-wise, the quick Google search for context, the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which can be understood and assessed. I don't like fully in there. I'll talk about that a little bit later probably. But so what does it mean to be effective with your context? To be effective with your context, you're asking the right kinds of questions. You probably have a culture of curiosity. But as an organization, you have to enable your team to be able to do those things. But another part of what's happening in our industry today as a result of all of this is that we're increasing the mental demands on everybody with this happening. So think about how much intuition any one particular engineer has to have to just move around your environment. What does it take to onboard somebody in your org? Are they up and running in a month? Does it take them 6? There's just a lot that you have to know and have loaded in your brain to be able to function or operate successfully in an organization. And the same can be said for process. If you have a change management process in your organization, you probably don't read the change management process every time you execute it. It's just something that you have loaded. And then there's this concept that's catching a little bit more momentum that I think is pretty interesting called continuous partial attention. So think about the person that's on call. Anyone here on call right now? Couple. Did you look at a production dashboard yet today? For any reason? Maybe you got paged, maybe you didn't. but that's something that you're spending cognitive cycles on now because you're on call, right? So you are partially attentive to that, whether you like it or not. And these are things that are really big mental demands for all of us in the industry today. So level set on a few of these things. I'm excited to say I spared no expense and I commissioned an artist for this next part of my talk. I wish I could say this was my 6-year-old. This is me. But I want to just unpack this a little bit more and really get into why I think this is a really important thing to think about how your context in your environment matters. So I think there's a few basic concepts here. As the complexity of your environment increases, the amount of context in your environment also increases. Whether you're having more services, whether your company gets bigger, you might have a new technology, you might have more products, whatever those things are that are driving up complexity, the amount of context that you have is there. So there's this idea that the amount of available context is increasing. It's probably exponential. It's probably not linear like this, but that's the general belief that I have today. So if we start thinking about what makes all of that up, in your organization, context that you might have are things like your monitoring tools, different observability things. Logs are obviously a huge part of context. That's why we're all here today. Incident management has context within it. You probably have some sort of documentation or operational readiness process that brings context to your services. You have a change management process. It's kind of important to know what's going on there. You probably have some performance reports, SLOs, SLIs were talked about a lot. And humans have a ton of context within them. On the complexity side of the spectrum, your architecture can really contribute to your complexity. You might be monolith, you might have microservices, you might be both. You probably have the thing that makes you all the money, and then the new thing that you think is going to make you money tomorrow, and they're both running in parallel, right? That's pretty complex. You probably are in the cloud. If you're not, you're thinking about it. You're likely highly dependent on third-party services. If you're running Docker, you're running Kube, you might be looking at service mesh technologies. Your org structure can introduce a lot of complexity. Anybody have like a change management process where they have to like go up 3 floors and find Frank, whoever Frank is, to hit the approve button because he's the change manager? That kind of thing can be really hard. And then the rate of change. How often are your services changing? What's changing when you're changing services? That can add a lot of complexity. And then technical debt's everywhere. Everyone has some amount of technical debt. It can vary, but there's a lot of complexity with that because it's not often that you're going back and improving those things if they're just sitting there and running. And I think we can all agree that AV is probably the hardest. Next to printers, probably the hardest thing, right? The AV crew here has been awesome, but whoa, that's a lot of stuff, right? If we step back and look at this picture as a whole and think about what in your environment is unique that makes your environment more complex, and what's the context that you can unpack from that, this is a lot of stuff. And so what I want to do for the rest of the talk is just go through how I've looked at some of this and seen some of these things be successful, and just talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've done at SPS that we've found valuable or interesting, and hopefully it just gives you ideas in different ways that you might think about context or organizing or structuring that within your environments. So while that's all being said, I think it's pretty fair to say that being effective with your context improves your ability to deliver services, giving your organization a competitive advantage. Whether it's being effective with change management, helping your velocity stay high so that you can win, or whether it's helping with your availability to stay high, making sense and being effective with your context gives your organization a competitive advantage. And when you boil all that down, that's a big deal, but it's really easy to not think about it that way. And then you don't put value on it, then you don't do something with your context. So let's go through the different kinds of context a little bit. The most important context is the people in your organization. How many people here today know something about your system or service that you know nobody else knows and isn't documented? Over half. I asked that question at a meetup a couple months ago, and somebody raised their hand, and it was their first day on the job that they were at. And they raised their hand to this question. That's a big deal. There's just a ton of stuff out there that's in all of our brains, and that drastically increases the importance in communication, how effective we can be. Sure, there's a lot of stuff we should document that we don't, but there's just a lot of stuff that's context that you have or somebody else has based on your understanding or perspective of a system that you have to use communication to get out of. It's really important to place a high amount of value on that, and there's nothing other than just getting good at people and process that's going to help you do that. The next is predefined metrics and thresholds. So this is the monitoring stuff. These are the things, the known knowns, right? You know you care about error rate. You know you care about availability. You know you care about request rate. Those are things that are out of the box things that you know you want to go measure. And then there's the observability chunk. This tends to be the biggest, where they're unknown things that you can go discover. And Sumo is a great tool for this, but in general you have tools or you have your own skills where you're able to go identify and discover different information about your environment. And then there's a last piece, a last chunk of context here that's kind of obscure and hard to find, and it's difficult and time consuming. And this is the kind of stuff where you probably had like a really good idea on a Thursday night, you spent your Friday hacking at this thing, and you got at this data, and then you got done and you just regretted your entire day because there was just no ROI in it. I'd argue there's just this amount of context that's in your environment that you just shouldn't waste time on. Like, you're not going to get the ROI out of it. You need it once a year, but you know what? You can live without it. Focus on the things that can bring you more value. So we'll unpack these a little bit. This is where I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've done at SPS that have worked really well, and hopefully it can give you some ideas as well. The first, on the people process side of things, about a year and a half ago, we started adopting this idea of operational readiness. It's something that Susan Fowler talks about in her book, Production Ready Microservices. But the concept of it is basically step back as an organization and talk about the things that are important to you in a service. If you're going to build a service, what would you want to see out of that service to determine it to be ready to be customer facing or to be ready to be in production? And you can kind of make that your own. We didn't quite follow what Susan did, but we ended up with 4 pillars. Operational information, so that's just the who's and where is it and that kind of stuff, just the basic things you want to know about a service. Performance, so these are things where we, are you cost effective? You run in the cloud? Do you have SLOs, SLIs? Agility, so we look a lot at like our change management data and figure out and understand like what velocity is there, how resilient are these services. And then there's people from security here, so I had to make them think that they're important too and put them on the board. Oh, no, but we have this idea of like readiness from a security perspective too that we're still vetting out and trying to mature that. But in general, this has been a nice structure because now as an organization with hundreds of engineers all kind of broken out into different product teams, we have some consistency layer. The people process layer is consistent, some terminology is consistent. There's been value in that. It can be the more boring side of some of the things you're doing, but there's a lot of value in it. And what we did with readiness is we said, if it's important at go live or deploy, it's important over time. So we built this idea of operational confidence, just essentially trying to take the data that we say is important at readiness and then measure it over time. So some things that we do, change rate is an example. So the very top service up here deploys twice a day. That's an awesome change rate. They have a really good agility score as a result of that. Their success rate isn't super great of their change rate, but you can see that their incident rate in general is in the 90s and their alert rates are in the 90s, so that's pretty decent. So kind of says their changes don't work, but they're resilient enough that it's not necessarily impacting customer experience. Whereas there's one down here, this third one from the bottom. So the change rate changes about once every 3 days or so. The success rate is almost down to 50%, and their alert rate is way down, or alert expense is way down, basically meaning it's one of the noisiest services we have. So the stability of that service isn't good. We don't have a high degree of confidence in that service. We don't have a high degree of confidence when we're going to make changes to that service. That context helps us make a lot of decisions. The very top line, I don't care at all when they're going to deploy. I have a ton of confidence in what they have going on as an org. This application here on the bottom that seems to break every other time they deploy and has a really high alert rate telling me their stability is not great, we need to really control when that deployment happens and really care about it and be rallied around it. And also, as an organization, we should invest more into making that better, right? This is an obvious place for us to make some investment. The next on the context string here is the monitoring stuff. This one's pretty basic. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one, but there's a lot of stuff you know about. And just thinking about it in terms of what do you want to share, what's consistent, what's not, I think you're probably all pretty well are pretty mature in this space if you're at the Sumo Logic conference anyway, but these are the known knowns. Think about things that you care about. We do things like our deploys, just kind of caring about our change rate and things like that over time too. Observability then is the last one, and this one's the really big one. Cindy has a great blog post really breaking down observability versus monitoring. But a couple of things to think about here is that visualization can bring a ton of context, right? There's a lot that you can pull out of a visualization. This doesn't help anybody because there's no values in it. But this is basically a visualization of utilization across the pool of services that we have. But you can get a lot of context out of that. But complexity can bring complexity. So this is AWS's architecture from 2015. And when you start to get into this type of a challenge, you run into scenarios where, that's probably S3 right in the middle. Everything depends on it, right? But then when S3 goes down and you go to update status page, I don't know if anyone else noticed that it was a couple years ago when they had their major S3 outage. Their status page depends on S3. So when S3 was down, they couldn't update their status page because of the dependency cycle I had. So this complexity that's out there today in that context would have been really valuable to have at some point before this incident, obviously, to make sense of that. And then from an observability perspective in Sumo, I mean, you can ask hard questions, you can be curious, or you can ask dumb questions, right? You can just go in there and search for error without adding a source category or anything and get rolling. That's really discoverable, that's really observable, and it lets you work through those things. So thinking about the different ways or the different observability that you have in your environment you can kind of challenge your team and your team members to get some more consistency around that, thinking about that differently, whether it's the AWS example or just general visualization. But with all that being said, and with the value of context top of mind, we can do a lot more with it. If you can step back and say, listen, context is really valuable. So take action on that. Go do some things with that. One of the things that we don't talk about nearly enough in this industry is the importance of data visualization. So you're nodding your head, have you heard of Edward Tufte before? Anyone else hear of Edward Tufte before? Couple? So Tufte has this concept, he's brilliant when it comes to data visualization, but this concept of visual literacy, which is the ability to interpret, negotiate, and make meaning from information presented in the form of an image. This is a really, really cool graph that he refers to often that Charles Menard made a long time ago. And why this is so interesting is because, has anyone ever seen this graph? A couple folks? This is so interesting because there are 6 different data points, there's more than 6 different data points on this graph, on this 2D visualization. So what this is actually a representation of is Napoleon's march on Russia. And the width of the line is the number of soldiers Napoleon had in his army. So that's the first data point. So the width of that line is how many soldiers he had. The color of the line is the direction. So tan is him and his army headed to Moscow, and black is coming back from Moscow. These drop-down lines here show latitude and longitude, but they also show temperature. It was unfortunately winter by the time they started coming back from Moscow. And then you also see different landmarks. So you can see like the rivers there. So it's kind of interesting, like you can see in the winter, when these black lines are coming back, they hit a river, and then the black line gets thinner because they have less soldiers, because rivers in the winter in Russia in the 1800s were pretty hard to cross, I think. So 1800s. But there's a lot that goes into that. A project that we had, I couldn't get the GIF to work right, but a project we'd played around with at SPS was that same idea, like how can we get more context into one screen? And Netflix has an interesting open source project called Visceral you could take a look at. But the idea is that you have all these nodes and these microservices, and then you can visualize the traffic to them. There's other tools that are doing this too. But I think I just want to show this as like an observability idea, that you can get a lot of context out of this type of thing, where you can see all your services, you can see the health of the services, but then you get context about the traffic between them, you can see error rates, you can see volume, things like that. And then just 2 other ideas. We at SPS like to think about like how can we push content when it's relevant. So some little things that we built are the idea of like taking action based on an event that happens. So an alert triggers, we have a series of Lambda functions that will just do documentation lookup and post them back to the PagerDuty alert. Super simple to write, and we can subscribe other ideas to that SNS topic and take other actions. So it's just a nice way for you to kind of think about context you might want to push to your engineers at the time they need it and write some automation. Another one we did with our incident management process was improve the way that we communicate out to our stakeholders based on incidents they might care about. But we also said, hey, when there's an incident happening, it'd be really nice to know if there's been recent changes for that service or dependency of that service. So we'll post back to an incident automatically if there's been any recent changes for those services. That's an example of context that's really valuable to have at the time of an event. Those have been kind of interesting projects, but you probably all have your own ways of looking at that. Similarly, somebody else could have an idea that they go forward on. So with all that being said, I would encourage all of you, if you don't take anything else away from this talk, just think about the fact that you all have your own context. You all have your own complexity, and your environments are unique. And I think if you keep context and just the value of context top of mind, you can leave here and think about how can you help your organization be more effective with your context, and now you maybe have a little different perspective or different ideas that you can hopefully take back and apply in your organization. Thank you.
Open the stage for questions. So do you use like Sumo search links as a context? For example, like if you get some alert, you could like generate like a search link where to search logs.
Yeah. Yeah, so some things that we've thought about doing there with operational readiness, we store a lot of data like the SLI data. And so visions that we have in the future is like if you can map dependencies and you can track like your SLIs with like a Sumo query, you can do more automation to like pull that context in at the time that it's relevant, or even like push it, right? So like if you're an engineer and you're on call and this alert is going off, what data inside Sumo would be valuable right now for you? That's different than the alert going off, right?
Yeah, like at Sumo internally, sometimes people doing few alerts, like, searching, oh, this is like typical call, so like look at these log lines, which likely contributed to these alerts.
Yep. Yeah, it's really fun when you start to think about stuff that you could document and then like actually engineer some automated solution instead. Like don't put it, if you find yourself putting in documentation some search string, just automate that and push that result at the time of the event.
Any other questions?
So I really agree that the human context has so much value, but is possibly the most difficult part to bring into problems you're trying to deal with. Maybe like the most unstructured data possible. So what are some ways you think about getting that information available to people when they need it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is the hardest one, and I think it totally depends on your company culture. So I think if you can get your organization to think about context with value and then like associate that to what's in people's brains, then you can get people to be willing to spend time on it. I mean, nothing's going to replace the people side of it other than time. And we live in a world where people would rather have their headphones on and sling code, right? So it's a really hard problem to solve. We use that operational confidence structure to like just give us a conversation platform and topics, right? So like we don't just like have an open-ended media agenda. We just say like, here are all the things that we think are important for service delivery. Let's all agree it's important enough that we're going to get together once a month or once a quarter and spend 2 hours and like really talk about this as it pertains to your service. And that's been working pretty well for us. It's slow. It's been a slow road, but we're seeing wins from that. Yeah, people are just the worst, aren't they?
That's right. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.